The gunshot cracked through the twilight air, and Frank Lawson dropped flat against the dusty earth of his cattle pen, his heart hammering as he watched the coyote that had been stalking his remaining chickens flee into the scrubland beyond his property line. His rifle was still warm in his hands when he heard the startled cry from somewhere near the front gate, a woman's voice high and frightened, and Frank cursed under his breath as he pushed himself to his feet and started running. She had fallen from her horse in her panic at the sound of gunfire, and now she sat in the dirt with her dark traveling skirts pooled around her, one hand clutching her ankle while the other tried to soothe her spooked mare. Frank slowed his approach as he drew closer, not wanting to frighten her further, and called out in what he hoped was a reassuring tone, "Madam, I apologize for startling you. I was just shooting at a coyote that has been troubling my livestock. Are you hurt?" The woman looked up at him, and even in the fading light of the Idaho evening, Frank could see that she was beautiful in a weary, travel-worn way. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes were a shade of green that reminded him of the Snake River in springtime. She appeared to be in her early 20s, perhaps 5 or 6 years younger than his own 30 years, and there was something in her expression that spoke of determination mixed with exhaustion. "I think my ankle is twisted," she said, her voice steadier now that she had gotten a good look at him. "I have been riding since dawn, and I suppose the sound of your rifle was the last straw for my nerves." Frank set his rifle aside carefully and approached her, kneeling down a respectful distance away. "May I take a look? I have some experience with injuries, having lived out here alone for the past few years." She hesitated only a moment before nodding, and Frank gently examined her ankle through her boot. It was swollen but not broken, he thought, and he told her so as he helped her to her feet. She winced, but managed to stand with his support, and he guided her toward her horse, which had calmed somewhat and was now grazing on the sparse grass near the fence line. "Where were you heading?" Frank asked as he gathered the mare's reins. "Wood River is about 5 miles south of here, if that is where you were bound." The woman shook her head slowly, and Frank saw tears gathering in her eyes despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composure. "I was trying to find my uncle's ranch. He wrote to me 6 months ago, inviting me to come stay with him after my father passed. The letter said his land was north of Wood River, along the Camas Creek Road, but I have been searching all day and cannot find any sign of his property. His name is Samuel Thompson, and he said his ranch was marked by a large cottonwood tree at the entrance." Frank felt his stomach drop. He knew the Thompson place, or rather, he knew what had happened there. The elderly rancher had died of pneumonia during the harsh winter, and his property had been purchased at auction by a land speculator from Boise, who was holding it for development. Frank had attended the funeral himself, one of only a handful of neighbors who had made the trek through the snow to pay their respects. "Madam, I am afraid I have some difficult news to share with you," he said quietly. "Samuel Thompson passed away this past February. The winter was particularly brutal and he took ill. There was nothing anyone could do." The woman went very still, and then she sank down onto a nearby rock, all the color draining from her face. "He is dead, but that cannot be. He was my only remaining family. My father's debts took everything we had, and I sold what little was left to pay for my passage west. I have nowhere else to go." Frank felt a wave of sympathy wash over him. He knew all too well what it was like to be alone in this harsh country. His own wife had died of fever 4 years ago, and his young son had followed her only weeks later, leaving Frank with nothing but this struggling ranch and memories that haunted him in the quiet hours of the night. "What is your name, madam?" he asked gently. "Sarah." "Sarah Thornton," she replied, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Miss Thornton, my name is Frank Lawson, and this is my ranch. It is not much, but I have a spare room and food enough for two. You are welcome to stay the night and rest that ankle. In the morning, we can figure out what options you might have." Sarah looked at him with those green eyes, searching his face for any sign of improper intentions, but Frank kept his expression open and honest. He had no interest in taking advantage of a woman in distress, and he hoped that showed clearly enough. "I do not want to impose on your hospitality," Sarah said finally. "You do not know me, and I have no way to repay your kindness." "Out here, we help each other when we can," Frank replied simply. "That is just the way of things. Besides, your uncle was a good man, and I like to think he would have done the same for any kin of mine if our situations were reversed." Sarah nodded slowly, accepting his logic, and Frank helped her to her feet once more. She could not put much weight on her injured ankle, so he ended up supporting most of her weight as they made their slow progress toward the modest ranch house. Her horse followed docilely behind them, and Frank made a mental note to get the animal settled in his small barn once he had Sarah situated inside. The ranch house was simple but clean, a two-room structure that Frank had built himself shortly after marrying his late wife. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that provided heat during the cold Idaho winters. The second room had been intended as a bedroom for children who never came, and after his family had died, Frank had moved his own sleeping pallet into the main room, unable to bear the memories that the bedroom held. He settled Sarah into a chair near the fireplace and went to start a fire, despite the warmth of the May evening. She looked chilled from shock, and he thought the cheerful crackle of flames might do something to lift her spirits. As he worked, he found himself studying her from the corner of his eye, noting the quality of her travel-stained dress and the education evident in her speech. She had clearly come from a better situation than the one she now found herself in, and Frank felt his protective instincts stirring in a way they had not since his wife had lived. "I will make us some supper," he said, once the fire was going well. "It will not be fancy, but I have beans and salt pork, and I baked bread just yesterday." "Thank you," Sarah said quietly. "You are being very kind to a stranger." Frank shrugged as he moved to the small kitchen area. "Like I said, it is just what neighbors do out here. Besides, I have been alone for a long time now. It is nice to have someone to cook for besides myself." As he prepared the meal, Sarah told him more about her journey west. She had come from Philadelphia, where her father had been a moderately successful merchant until a series of bad investments and a fire that destroyed his warehouse had left him destitute. He had died of a heart ailment brought on by stress, and Sarah had been left with nothing but the small amount of money from selling their household goods and the letter from her uncle promising her a home. "I should have written to confirm before I made the journey," she said, her voice thick with regret. "But I was so desperate to leave Philadelphia. There were creditors circling, and some of them were suggesting I might work off my father's debts in ways that were not respectable. I thought if I could just get here, everything would be all right." Frank felt anger rise in his chest at the thought of men trying to take advantage of her situation, but he kept his voice calm as he replied, "You made the best decision you could with the information you had. No one can fault you for that." They ate in companionable silence, and Frank was pleased to see some color returning to Sarah's cheeks as she consumed the simple meal. He made tea from the precious store he kept for special occasions, and she accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her hands around it as if drawing warmth from the ceramic. "What will you do now?" Frank asked when they had finished eating. "Do you have any other family or friends who might take you in?" Sarah shook her head. No one. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father, and I have no siblings. I suppose I will have to find work in Wood River or one of the other towns, perhaps as a teacher or a seamstress. I have some education and skills that might be useful. Frank nodded thoughtfully. There might be positions available. The school teacher in Wood River got married last month and moved to Boise with her new husband. The town council has been looking for a replacement. Do you have teaching experience? Some, Sarah admitted. I helped my father tutor the children of his business associates for extra money after our circumstances changed. I know Latin and Greek, mathematics, history and literature. I can also teach music and drawing if needed. That is more qualification than most teachers out here can claim, Frank said. I think you would have a good chance of getting the position if you applied. Wood River is a small town, but it is growing. The railroad is talking about extending a branch line this way, and that would bring more settlers. Sarah looked at him with something that might have been hope in her eyes. Do you really think they would hire me, even though I am newly arrived and have no references from this area? I think your education speaks for itself, Frank replied. And if you need someone to vouch for your character, I would be happy to do so. Samuel spoke highly of you in the months before he died. He mentioned his niece back east several times, and he was looking forward to your arrival. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks again, and this time she made no effort to hide them. I wish I had come sooner. I wish I had not waited so long to accept his invitation. Perhaps if I had been here during the winter, I could have helped care for him. Frank moved to her side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The winter was brutal, and the pneumonia came on fast. Even the doctor from Boise could not help him. You must not blame yourself for circumstances beyond your control. Sarah reached up and placed her hand over his, and Frank felt something stir in his chest that he had thought long dead. It was not attraction exactly, though he could not deny that she was beautiful. It was more a sense of connection, of recognition that here was someone who understood loss and loneliness as intimately as he did. You are a good man, Frank Lawson, Sarah said softly. Your wife must have loved you very much. The words hit Frank like a physical blow, but not an unpleasant one. He had avoided speaking about his lost family for so long that hearing them mentioned felt like lancing an old wound, painful but somehow cleansing. She did, he said quietly. And I loved her. But that was a long time ago now, and I have learned that life goes on whether we want it to or not. They sat together in the firelight for a while longer, not speaking but finding comfort in each other's presence. Eventually, Frank showed Sarah to the spare bedroom, bringing her clean blankets and a pitcher of water for washing. He apologized for the dust and the sparse furnishings, but Sarah assured him that after weeks of sleeping in boarding houses and one particularly unpleasant night camping beside the road, any bed would feel like luxury. Frank returned to the main room and laid out his bedroll near the dying fire, but sleep was slow to come. He found himself thinking about the woman in the next room, about her courage in making the journey west alone, and her grace in the face of devastating news. He thought about the way her hand had felt over his, warm and alive, and he realized with a start that he was feeling something he had not felt in years: hope for the future. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Frank woke to find Sarah already up and attempting to help with breakfast despite her injured ankle. He shooed her back to a chair and took over the cooking himself, making flapjacks with the last of his flour and frying up thick slices of bacon. They ate together as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Frank found himself reluctant to bring up the subject of taking her into Wood River. "How is your ankle feeling this morning?" he asked instead. Sarah flexed her foot experimentally and winced. "Better than last night, but still tender." I do not think I could ride for any distance today." "Then you should stay another day and rest," Frank said immediately. "There is no sense in risking further injury by rushing into town. The teaching position will still be there tomorrow or the day after." Sarah looked at him with a small smile. "Are you sure you do not mind having a guest for another day? I know you have work to do around the ranch, and I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Frank assured her. "In fact, if you are feeling up to it, perhaps you could help me with some of the lighter chores. I have been meaning to organize the chaos that passes for my record keeping, and I have a vegetable garden that could use weeding. Nothing that would strain your ankle." Sarah brightened at the suggestion. "I would be happy to help. I feel useless sitting here when you have been so kind to me." They spent the day working together in an easy rhythm that surprised Frank with its naturalness. Sarah proved to be intelligent and capable, quickly understanding his ranching records and suggesting a better system for organizing them. In the afternoon, she sat on an overturned bucket in the garden and pulled weeds while Frank repaired a section of fence that had been damaged in a recent windstorm. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future, and Frank found himself opening up in ways he had not with anyone since his wife had died. Sarah told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her father's business and the gradual decline of their fortunes. She spoke of her mother, who had died when Sarah was only 12, and the loneliness of being an only child in a household preoccupied with financial troubles. Frank, in turn, found himself telling her about his marriage, about the joy of his son's birth, and the crushing despair when fever had taken them both within a month. "I blamed myself for a long time," Frank admitted as they sat on the porch in the evening, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "I thought if I had gotten the doctor sooner, if I had somehow been more vigilant, I could have saved them. It took me years to accept that some things are simply beyond our control." "But you stayed here," Sarah observed. "You did not leave this place despite all the painful memories it must hold." Frank nodded slowly. "I thought about leaving. I even packed up once, intending to head to California or Oregon. But in the end, I could not do it. This ranch represents everything I worked for, everything I dreamed of building with my family. Leaving would have felt like admitting defeat, like saying their lives meant nothing. So I stayed, and I kept working, and eventually the pain dulled enough that I could bear it." Sarah reached over and took his hand, her fingers threading through his with a naturalness that made Frank's heart skip. "I understand that. After my father died, well-meaning friends suggested I should try to forget, to move on as if he had never existed. But he was my father, and loving him was not something I could simply stop doing because he was gone. The love remains even when the person does not." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands joined, and Frank felt something shift in his chest. It was not that the pain of his loss had disappeared, but rather that it had been joined by something new and bright and alive. He looked at Sarah's profile in the dimming light and realized that he was falling for her, this unexpected traveler who had stumbled into his life with nothing but heartbreak and determination in her pockets. "Sarah," he said softly, "I know we have only just met, and I know your life is complicated right now. But I want you to know that you do not have to face your troubles alone. Whatever you need, whether it is help getting the teaching position or just someone to talk to, I am here for you." Sarah turned to face him, and even in the near darkness, he could see the tears shining in her eyes. "Why are you being so kind to me? You do not owe me anything." "Because kindness is what we owe each other as human beings," Frank replied simply. "And because I know what it is like to feel alone in the world, and I would not wish that feeling on anyone." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and Frank wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat that way for a long time, drawing comfort from each other's presence, and when they finally went inside for the night, Frank felt more at peace than he had in years. The next day, Sarah's ankle was much improved, and Frank hitched up his wagon to drive her into Wood River. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with businesses catering to the ranchers and farmers who worked the surrounding land. The general store, the bank, the saloon, and the church formed the heart of the community, and Frank pointed out various landmarks as they drove through town. "That is the schoolhouse there," he said, indicating a small white building on the edge of town. "And the town council meets in the back room of the general store. We should speak to Mr. Harrison, who owns the store. He is the head of the council and will be the one to approve your hire if you are offered the position." Frank helped Sarah down from the wagon, conscious of her still tender ankle, and they walked together into the general store. It was a well-stocked establishment, with everything from dry goods to farm implements lining the shelves, and the proprietor, a portly man in his 50s, greeted Frank with genuine warmth. "Frank Lawson, as I live and breathe. I have not seen you in town for near on a month." "What brings you in today?" "Hello, George," Frank replied. "I have brought Miss Sarah Thornton to speak with you about the teaching position. She is Samuel Thompson's niece, just arrived from Philadelphia." George Harrison's expression sobered at the mention of Samuel Thompson. "Ah, miss, I am sorry for your loss. Your uncle was a fine man, and we all felt his passing keenly. But you say you are interested in teaching. What qualifications do you have?" Sarah outlined her education and experience, speaking clearly and confidently despite her nervousness. Frank watched with pride as she impressed George with her knowledge and her obvious dedication to education. By the time she finished speaking, the store owner was nodding enthusiastically. "Miss Thornton, I think you would be an excellent addition to our little community. The position pays $25 a month, plus use of the teacher's cottage behind the schoolhouse. Classes run from September through May, with summers off. If you are interested, I would be happy to recommend you to the rest of the council, though I cannot imagine they would object." "When would you be able to start?" Sarah glanced at Frank before answering. "The school term has already begun for the year, has it not? I could start immediately if needed, though I understand if you would prefer to wait until the fall term." George waved a dismissive hand. "The children have been without a proper teacher for over a month now, just getting occasional lessons from their parents. If you are willing to step in now and finish out the term, I am sure the parents would be grateful. You would have the summer to settle in and prepare for the fall, and it would give everyone a chance to get to know you." "Then I accept," Sarah said with a smile that made Frank's heart lift. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Harrison. I promise you will not regret it." After finalizing the details of Sarah's employment, Frank and Sarah left the store and walked toward the schoolhouse so she could see her new workplace. The teacher's cottage was small but adequate, with a bedroom, a sitting room, and a tiny kitchen. It needed some cleaning and repairs, Frank noted, but nothing that could not be accomplished with a few days' work. "It is perfect," Sarah said, looking around the dusty rooms with satisfaction. "I can make this into a real home." Frank felt an unexpected pang at those words. He had enjoyed having Sarah at his ranch these past 2 days, and the thought of her living here in town, miles away from his property, left him feeling hollow. But he pushed the feeling aside and focused on being happy for her good fortune. "I can help you get the place cleaned up and ready," he offered, "and I will bring your trunk and belongings from the boarding house in Boise once we arrange for their transport." Sarah turned to him with gratitude shining in her eyes. "You have already done so much for me, Frank. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "You do not need to repay me," Frank said firmly. Seeing you happy and settled is payment enough. But even as he said the words, Frank knew they were not entirely true. What he really wanted was to keep Sarah in his life, to continue the connection they had begun to forge over the past 2 days. The thought of returning to his lonely ranch without her filled him with a dread he had not felt since the dark days after his family's death. They spent the rest of the day purchasing supplies for the cottage and beginning the process of making it habitable. Frank threw himself into the physical labor, scrubbing floors and repairing loose boards, while Sarah organized and planned how she would arrange her new home. By the time evening fell, the cottage was much improved, though there was still work to be done. "You should stay at my ranch again tonight," Frank suggested as they locked up the cottage. "There is no sense in you trying to sleep here before we have finished cleaning, and your ankle could still use another day of rest." Sarah hesitated, and Frank could see the conflict in her expression. She wanted to maintain propriety, he knew, but she also recognized the practical wisdom of his suggestion. Finally, she nodded. "One more night," she agreed. "But tomorrow I should stay here, even if the cottage is not perfect yet. People will talk if I continue to stay at your ranch unchaperoned." Frank knew she was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the tightness in his chest. They drove back to the ranch in comfortable silence, and Frank found himself memorizing the way Sarah looked in the evening light, the way her hair caught the red and gold of the sunset, the curve of her smile when she pointed out a family of deer grazing near the road. That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch again, and Frank found himself reaching for Sarah's hand without conscious thought. She did not pull away, instead lacing her fingers through his and leaning against his shoulder. "I am going to miss this," she said softly. "These past few days have been strange and difficult, but also strangely wonderful. You have made me feel less alone than I have felt in years." "I am going to miss it too," Frank admitted. "The ranch has felt more like a home these past days than it has since my wife died." "You have brought life back into these walls." Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes searching his face in the lamplight that spilled from the windows. "Frank, I know we have only known each other a short time, but I feel a connection to you that I cannot explain. Is it wrong of me to feel this way so soon after meeting you?" Frank's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she must be able to hear it. "No," he said hoarsely. "It is not wrong at all. I feel it too, Sarah. I have felt it since the moment you looked up at me from the dust of that road." "What does this mean for us?" Sarah asked. "I have to take this teaching position. It is my only means of supporting myself, but the thought of living apart from you feels wrong somehow." Frank took a deep breath, knowing he was about to take a leap that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "Then do not live apart from me. Marry me, Sarah. I know it is fast, and I know you might think I am mad for suggesting it, but I am 30 years old and I know my own heart. You are the first person since my wife died who has made me want to live again instead of just exist. Marry me, and we can face whatever comes together." Sarah's eyes went wide with shock. "Frank, we have known each other for 3 days. How can you be sure?" "How can I not be?" Frank countered. "In 3 days, you have reminded me what it feels like to hope, to laugh, to look forward to waking up in the morning. I am not asking you to give up the teaching position. You can still teach if you want to, but do it as my wife from my home, with me supporting you in every way I can." Tears were streaming down Sarah's cheeks now, but she was smiling through them. "My father would have said you are a romantic fool." "Perhaps I am," Frank agreed, "but that does not make my feelings any less real." Sarah reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "Then yes, Frank Lawson. Yes, I will marry you, because you are right. We have only known each other a short time, but I feel more at home with you than I have felt anywhere else in the world. When you asked me about finding my way home yesterday, I wanted to tell you that I already had found it. My home is wherever you are." Frank felt joy explode in his chest, and he pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her close and breathing in the scent of her hair. "We will make a good life together," he promised. "I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to make you happy." "You already have," Sarah whispered against his chest. "You already have." They were married a week later in the small church in Wood River, with George Harrison and his wife standing as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple dress of pale blue that Frank had purchased from the dressmaker in town, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Frank had gathered from the meadow near his ranch. The ceremony was short but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Frank kissed Sarah with a tenderness that made several of the watching townspeople wipe away tears. The town had been surprised by the speed of the courtship, but most people approved once they heard the story of how Sarah had arrived seeking her dead uncle and found Frank instead. There was something romantic about the tale that appealed to the settlers of Wood River, most of whom had their own stories of hardship and unexpected good fortune in the harsh Western territories. Sarah moved into Frank's ranch house as his wife, and they quickly fell into a comfortable routine. She took up her teaching duties at the school, and Frank was proud of the reports that filtered back to him about her skill and dedication. The children loved her, and their parents appreciated the quality education she provided. In the evenings, she would return to the ranch and help Frank with the lighter chores, and they would spend their nights talking and planning for the future. Frank found himself falling more deeply in love with his wife with each passing day. Sarah was intelligent and kind, with a dry sense of humor that surprised him, and a core of steel that had been forged by the hardships she had endured. She was not afraid of hard work, and she threw herself into making the ranch house a true home, planting flowers in the yard and sewing curtains for the windows. Under her care, the place began to look less like the dwelling of a lonely widower and more like a real family home. As spring turned to summer, Sarah finished out the school term and had her first real break since arriving in Idaho. Frank took advantage of the time to show her more of the land he loved, taking her on rides through the hills and teaching her about ranching. She proved to be a quick learner, and Frank was delighted by her genuine interest in his work. One evening in late June, as they sat together watching the sun set from their favorite spot on the porch, Sarah took Frank's hand and placed it on her stomach. "There is something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of nervousness and joy. Frank looked at her questioningly, and then understanding dawned as he felt the slight roundness beneath her dress that he had been too preoccupied to notice before. "Sarah, are you saying what I think you are saying?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I am with child, Frank. We are going to have a baby." Frank felt as though all the air had been knocked from his lungs. A baby. After years of believing he would never be a father again, he was going to have another child. The joy was almost overwhelming, but it was tinged with fear as well. He had lost one wife and child to illness. What if history repeated itself? Sarah must have seen the fear in his expression because she squeezed his hand tightly. "I know you are afraid," she said gently. "I am afraid too, but we cannot let fear rob us of this joy. This child is a gift, Frank, and we will face whatever comes together." Frank pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her as carefully as if she were made of glass. "You are right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "This is a gift, and I will not waste it by being afraid. We are going to have a baby, Sarah, and I am going to love both of you with everything I have." The months that followed were some of the happiest of Frank's life. He threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival, fixing up the spare bedroom and building a cradle from oak wood that he polished until it gleamed. Sarah continued teaching through the early months of her pregnancy. But as fall turned to winter and her condition became more obvious, she took leave from the school with the understanding that she would return the following year if she wished. The winter was mild by Idaho standards, which Frank took as a good sign. He fussed over Sarah constantly, making sure she was warm and well-fed, and she tolerated his hovering with good humor. They spent long evenings by the fire, with Sarah knitting tiny garments for the baby while Frank read aloud from books borrowed from the small library in Wood River. In February, when the snow was still thick on the ground but the days were beginning to grow longer, Sarah went into labor. Frank had arranged for the doctor from Boise to be staying in Wood River for the week of the expected birth, and he rode into town through the pre-dawn darkness to fetch him, his heart pounding with fear and anticipation. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Frank thought he might lose his mind from worry. But Sarah was strong, and when the baby finally arrived just as the sun was setting on a cold winter evening, Frank's fears melted away at the sound of his child's lusty cry. "It is a boy," the doctor announced with satisfaction. "A healthy baby boy, and your wife came through just fine, Mr. Lawson. You have a beautiful family." Frank approached the bed where Sarah lay exhausted but smiling, holding their son wrapped in one of the blankets she had knitted. The baby had a shock of dark hair like his mother and what looked like it might be Frank's nose, and he was the most perfect thing Frank had ever seen. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked softly, looking up at Frank with love shining in her eyes. Frank thought for a moment, then said, "I would like to name him Thomas after my father. Thomas Samuel, if that is all right with you. Samuel for your uncle." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Samuel Lawson. It is perfect." Frank reached out and gently touched his son's tiny hand, marveling as the baby's fingers immediately wrapped around his own. "Hello, Thomas," he whispered. "Welcome to the world, son. Your mother and I have been waiting for you." As winter gave way to spring, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Thomas proved to be a healthy and happy baby, and Frank found himself amazed by the depth of love he felt for his son. It was different from the love he had felt for his first child, shaped by different circumstances, and tempered by the knowledge of how precious and fragile life could be. He treasured every moment, from the middle of the night feedings to the first smiles to the way Thomas would quiet immediately when Frank sang to him in his rough, off-key voice. Sarah was a wonderful mother, patient and loving, and watching her with their son made Frank fall even more deeply in love with her. She had transformed his life so completely that he could barely remember what it had been like to live alone in this house, going through the motions of existence without real joy or purpose. One evening in May, almost exactly a year after Sarah had first arrived at his ranch, they sat together on the porch with Thomas sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of the wildflowers blooming in the meadow, and Frank felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful. "You ever regret it?" he asked Sarah quietly. "Marrying me so quickly, giving up your chance to be independent and make your own way?" Sarah looked at him with surprise. "Regret it? Frank, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. I was not giving up independence. I was choosing partnership. I was choosing love and family and a life worth living." "I just want you to be happy," Frank said. "I want you to have everything you dreamed of." "I am happy," Sarah assured him. "I have a husband I love, a beautiful son, and a home that fills my heart with joy every time I see it. What more could I possibly want?" Frank smiled and leaned over to kiss her gently. "I love you, Sarah Lawson." I loved you from the moment you fell off your horse at my gate, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you," Sarah replied. "You gave me directions home that day, but what you did not realize was that you already were my home. You and this ranch and the life we are building together. This is where I belong, Frank. This is where I have always belonged." As the years passed, Frank and Sarah's life together continued to be marked by love and joy. They had 3 more children, 2 daughters and another son, and the ranch house that had once been silent and empty rang with the sounds of laughter and play. Sarah returned to teaching part-time once the children were older, and she became one of the most respected educators in the county. Frank's ranch prospered under his careful management, and he was able to expand his holdings and improve his herd. Thomas grew into a sturdy, cheerful boy who loved helping his father with the ranch work and listening to his mother read stories in the evening. His sisters, Emma and Grace, were both intelligent and spirited, and his younger brother, William, followed Thomas around like a devoted shadow. The Lawson family became known throughout Wood River as good people, generous neighbors, and pillars of the growing community. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank surprised Sarah with a trip to Boise, leaving the children in the care of George Harrison's wife for a long weekend. They stayed in a fine hotel and attended a theater performance, and Sarah laughed and said she felt like a fine lady instead of a rancher's wife. "You are a fine lady," Frank told her seriously as they walked through the city streets hand in hand. "The finest I have ever known. And you are also a rancher's wife, a teacher, a mother, and the love of my life. You are all of those things and more, and I am grateful every single day that you chose to share your life with me." Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him, her green eyes as bright and beautiful as they had been on the day they met. "I could have searched the entire world and never found anyone better than you, Frank Lawson. You saved me when I was lost, in more ways than one, and you have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. I would choose you again in a heartbeat, and I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of our lives." They kissed there on the street in Boise, not caring who might see them, and Frank felt the same rush of joy and rightness that he had felt on their wedding day. This was his life now, full and rich and overflowing with love, and it had all started with a chance encounter on a dusty Idaho road. 20 years after that first meeting, Frank and Sarah sat together on the porch of their ranch house, now expanded and improved to accommodate their large family. Their children were grown or nearly so, with Thomas preparing to take over the ranch operations, and Emma engaged to be married to the son of a neighboring rancher. Grace was attending normal school in Boise, studying to become a teacher like her mother, and William, at 15, was already showing promise as a skilled horseman and cattleman. The ranch had grown substantially over the years, and Frank now employed several hands to help with the work. The town of Wood River had grown as well, with the arrival of the railroad bringing new settlers and prosperity to the region. Sarah had retired from regular teaching but still occasionally tutored students who needed extra help, and she had become known for her charitable work, helping new arrivals to the area get established just as Frank had once helped her. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked, her head resting on Frank's shoulder in the familiar way that had become second nature over their years together. "Every detail," Frank replied. "I remember the sound of your voice when you cried out in surprise at my gunshot. I remember the way you looked sitting in the dust with your hair coming loose from its pins. I remember thinking that you were the most beautiful thing I had seen in years, even covered in road dust and scared half to death." Sarah laughed softly. "I remember being terrified at first, and then feeling this strange sense of calm when I looked at your face. You had kind eyes, even though you were holding a rifle. And then, when you told me about my uncle, I thought my world was ending. I had nothing and no one, and I was so far from everything I had known. But you did not give up, Frank said admirably. You were brave and determined, and you made a new life for yourself here. We made a new life, Sarah corrected. Together. That is the important part, Frank. We did it together, and we have been doing everything together ever since. Frank pulled Sarah closer, marveling at how, after all these years, her presence still filled him with peace and joy. You told me once that I was your home. Do you still feel that way? Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held 20 years of love and laughter and shared struggles. More than ever. This ranch, this life, our children and grandchildren to come, all of it matters because you are at the center of it. You are my home, Frank Lawson, and I am yours. That is what home really means, I think. Not a place, but a person you cannot imagine living without. As the sun set over the Idaho hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frank held his wife close and reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. He had been a lonely rancher, going through the motions of life without real purpose or joy, and then a lost traveler had stumbled into his world asking for directions home. He had tried to help her, never imagining that in doing so he would find his own way home as well. Their 4 children had blessed them with 11 grandchildren over the years, and the ranch had been divided among them to ensure the land stayed in the family. Thomas and his wife lived in the main house now with their 5 children, having taken over the primary ranching operations, while Frank and Sarah moved into a smaller cottage on the property that Frank had built specifically for their retirement years. Emma's husband had inherited his father's ranch, and between the 2 properties, they ran a substantial cattle operation that was known throughout Idaho for the quality of its stock. Grace had become the head teacher at the Wood River School, following in her mother's footsteps with a passion for education that made both Frank and Sarah proud. William had married a girl from Boise and started his own ranch on land Frank had helped him purchase, and he was already making a name for himself as one of the best horsemen in the territory. Frank was in his 60s now, his hair gray and his body showing the effects of a lifetime of hard physical labor, but he was still strong and active. Sarah's dark hair was threaded with silver, and her face bore the lines of a life well lived, but to Frank, she was as beautiful as she had been on the day they met. They spent their days in comfortable companionship, helping with the grandchildren, working in Sarah's extensive garden, and enjoying the fruits of the life they had built together. One afternoon in late summer, Frank and Sarah took a ride together out to the spot where they had first met, the place where Sarah had fallen from her horse at the sound of his rifle. It was a pilgrimage they made every year on the anniversary of that day, a way of honoring the chance encounter that had changed both their lives. They stood together at the old fence line, now weathered and gray with age, and Frank put his arm around Sarah's waist. If someone had told me that day that the scared woman in the road would become the love of my life and the mother of my children, I would have thought them mad. But here we are, 30 years later, and I cannot imagine my life without you. Sarah leaned into him, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. I was so lost that day, Frank, lost in every sense of the word. I had no family, no home, no idea what I was going to do with my life. And then you appeared like something out of a story and offered me shelter and kindness when you had no reason to. I had every reason, Frank corrected gently. You needed help, and helping you was the rightest thing I ever did. Well, that and asking you to marry me. Sarah laughed, the sound as warm and bright as it had been when she was a young woman. You were so earnest when you proposed, so serious and determined. I think I knew even then that saying yes was the only possible answer, even though it seemed crazy to marry a man I had known for only 3 days. "The heart knows what it knows," Frank said. "And my heart knew you were meant to be mine from the very beginning." They stayed at that spot for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky and remembering all the years that had brought them from that first meeting to this moment. They talked about their children and grandchildren, about the changes they had seen in the land and the community, about their hopes and dreams for the future. As they rode back to the ranch, taking their time and enjoying the warm afternoon, Frank found himself feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the life he had been given. He had known loss and loneliness, but he had also known great love and joy. He had a family who loved him, a legacy that would continue long after he was gone, and beside him, the woman who had made it all possible. That evening, as was their custom, Frank and Sarah sat on the porch of their cottage and watched the grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas's oldest son was teaching the younger ones to rope a fence post, and the air was filled with their shouts of triumph and groans of frustration. Sarah was knitting a blanket for Emma, who was expecting her 6th child, and Frank was whittling a toy horse for William's youngest. "We did good, did we not?" Sarah asked softly, her eyes on the children. "We did very good," Frank agreed. "We built something lasting, something that will go on long after we are gone. Our children know what it means to love and be loved, to work hard and to treat others with kindness. We gave them roots and wings, just like we planned." Sarah set down her knitting and took Frank's hand. "I have been thinking lately about the question you asked me all those years ago, about whether I have everything I dreamed of. And I realized that you gave me something better than my dreams, Frank. You gave me a reality that was richer and more fulfilling than anything I could have imagined as a young woman. You gave me purpose and partnership, and a love that has sustained me through every challenge." Frank brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You gave me the same, Sarah. You brought me back to life when I thought I was dead inside. You filled my home with love and laughter. You gave me children and grandchildren and a reason to wake up grateful every morning. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." As the sun set on another beautiful Idaho evening, Frank Lawson looked at the life he had built and felt nothing but contentment. He was an old man now, with more years behind him than ahead, but he had lived well and loved deeply. The lonely rancher who had once existed in this place was gone, replaced by a man who knew the true meaning of home. It was not about walls and a roof, not really. Home was about the people you loved and who loved you in return. Home was about shared struggles and shared triumphs, about building something together that was greater than what either of you could have built alone. Home was about finding the person who made you want to be better, to do more, to love harder. Frank had found his home in Sarah, just as she had found hers in him, and together they had created a legacy that would endure for generations. As he sat there with his wife's hand in his, surrounded by the sounds of family and the beauty of the land he loved, Frank Lawson knew that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly who he was supposed to be with, and that was the greatest gift life could offer. The years continued to pass gently for Frank and Sarah, filled with the quiet joys of a life well lived. They celebrated births and weddings, mourned the passing of old friends, and watched with pride as their children's children began to have children of their own. The ranch continued to prosper under Thomas's management, and the Lawson name became synonymous with quality cattle and good business practices throughout Idaho and beyond. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a celebration that lasted 3 days. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren came from all over the territory, filling the ranch house, and the surrounding cottages with noise and love and laughter. There was a great feast, with tables laden with food stretching across the yard, and dancing to fiddle music that lasted long into the night. Frank stood with Sarah under a canopy of stars, swaying gently to the music, and felt tears pricking at his eyes. "Look at all of this," he said, gesturing at the crowd of family surrounding them. "All of this came from one moment, one decision to help a stranger who stumbled onto my property asking for directions." Sarah smiled up at him, her face lined with age but still beautiful in the lamplight. "Not just one decision. Thousands of decisions, Frank. We decided to be kind to each other every day. We decided to work together, to support each other, to forgive each other when we made mistakes. We decided to love each other through good times and bad, through loss and joy, through every challenge life threw at us. That is what built all of this." She was right, of course. She usually was. Their marriage had not been perfect because no marriage was, but it had been real and deep and lasting. They had fought sometimes, disagreed often, struggled through difficult years when money was tight or children were sick, or the weight of responsibility felt too heavy to bear. But they had always come back to each other, always chosen each other, always remembered that they were stronger together than apart. Frank kissed Sarah then, in front of all their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the gathered family erupted in cheers and applause. When he finally pulled back, Sarah was laughing and crying at the same time, and Frank thought his heart might burst from the sheer joy of the moment. As they grew older still, Frank and Sarah's world gradually grew smaller, limited more by their aging bodies than by any lack of desire to be active. They spent their days in the cottage, receiving visits from family, and enjoying the simple pleasures of each other's company. Sarah read aloud from the newspaper each morning, and Frank would share his thoughts on the changing world, marveling at the progress he had seen in his lifetime while also lamenting some of the old ways that were being lost. They took short walks together when the weather was fine, moving slowly but steadily around the property that had been their home for so many years. Frank would point out changes and improvements, or reminisce about things that had happened in various spots. Sarah would add her own memories, and together they would weave the story of their life, remembering and honoring all the moments that had brought them to the present. One crisp autumn morning, when the aspens were blazing gold on the hillsides, and the air held the first real bite of approaching winter, Frank woke to find Sarah still asleep beside him. Her breathing was shallow but peaceful, and Frank lay quietly, watching her and thinking about how lucky he was to have spent his life with this woman. He thought about the scared, determined girl who had ridden onto his property all those years ago, and the strong, loving woman she had become. He thought about their children and their legacy, and he felt a deep satisfaction that transcended any fears he might have about the future. When Sarah finally stirred and opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Frank's face, and she smiled. "Good morning, my love." "Have you been watching me sleep?" "Just for a little while," Frank admitted. "I was thinking about how grateful I am for every day we have had together. Every single day has been a gift." Sarah reached out and touched his face, her hand trembling slightly with age. "Every day with you has been a gift for me too, Frank. Even the hard days, even the days when we struggled because we faced them together. You kept your promise, you know. The promise you made on our wedding day. You made me happy, Frank Lawson. You made me so very happy." They stayed in bed longer than usual that morning, talking and reminiscing, and by the time they finally rose and dressed, the sun was high in the sky. Thomas stopped by to check on them, as he did every day, and brought news of the ranch and the family. His oldest daughter was engaged to be married, and his youngest son had just won a prize at the county fair for his bull riding skills. Life was going on, the family was thriving, and Frank and Sarah took comfort in knowing that their legacy was secure. As winter set in, Sarah developed a persistent cough that worried Frank and the rest of the family. The doctor came from town and prescribed rest and warm liquids, assuring them that it was nothing serious, just the normal ailments of age. But Frank had seen too much in his life to be entirely reassured, and he devoted himself to caring for Sarah with a tenderness that brought tears to their children's eyes. He read to her when she was too tired to read for herself, made her special teas with honey from their own hives, and sat beside her bed for hours, holding her hand and telling her stories of their life together. Sarah would listen with closed eyes, occasionally squeezing his hand or murmuring a response, and Frank treasured every moment, knowing in his heart that their time together was drawing to a close. One evening in late December, as snow fell softly outside their cottage and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, Sarah asked Frank to help her to the window so she could see the winter landscape. He supported her weight carefully, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and together they looked out at the ranch that had been their home for more than 4 decades. "It is beautiful," Sarah said softly. "I am so glad this is the last thing I will see. Our home, our land, the life we built together." "Do not talk like that," Frank said, even though he knew she was right. "You are going to be fine. You are strong. You have always been strong." Sarah turned to look at him, and in her eyes Frank saw acceptance and peace. "I am 83 years old, my love. I have lived a long and wonderful life, and I am not afraid of what comes next, but I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Frank said, his voice breaking. "Promise me you will not mourn for too long. Promise me you will remember the joy we shared and not just the sadness of saying goodbye. Promise me you will live the time you have left surrounded by family and love, not locked away with grief. Can you promise me that?" Frank could not speak for a moment, his throat too tight with emotion. Finally, he managed to say, "I promise. But you have to promise me something too. Promise me you will wait for me wherever you are going. Promise me that when my time comes, you will be there to welcome me home." Sarah smiled, a radiant expression that reminded Frank of the young woman she had once been. "I will always be your home, Frank. Always. Death does not change that. I will wait for you for as long as it takes, and when you finally join me, we will be together again. That is my promise to you." She died peacefully 3 days later in her sleep, with Frank holding her hand and their children gathered around them. The funeral was the largest Wood River had ever seen, with people coming from all over Idaho to pay their respects to the woman who had touched so many lives through her teaching, her kindness, and her unwavering dedication to family and community. Frank mourned deeply, as anyone would who had lost a partner of more than 40 years, but he kept his promise to Sarah. He did not lock himself away with his grief. Instead, he let his family surround him with love and support. He continued to take his walks around the property, though now he walked alone, and he talked to Sarah as if she were still beside him, telling her about the grandchildren and the ranch, and all the small details of life that he knew she would want to hear. He lived for 2 more years after Sarah's passing, years that were bittersweet but not empty. He watched another generation of Lawsons come into the world, held his great-great-grandchildren, and took satisfaction in seeing the legacy he and Sarah had built continuing to flourish. He told stories to anyone who would listen, making sure that future generations would know about the woman who had transformed his life, and the love that had sustained them both through decades of joy and sorrow. On a warm spring morning, almost exactly 50 years after the day he had first met Sarah, Frank Lawson died quietly in his sleep. He was found by Thomas, who had come to bring him breakfast, lying peacefully in his bed with a slight smile on his face, as if he had just heard some wonderful news. The family buried him beside Sarah in the little cemetery on the hill, overlooking the ranch, and the entire community came to pay their respects to the man who had been a pillar of Wood River for more than 5 decades. But as his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren stood around his grave, they did not feel only sadness. They felt gratitude for the life he had lived and the example he had set. They felt pride in the legacy he had left them. And they felt certain, in a way that transcended logic or reason, that Frank was finally home again, reunited with the woman who had been his heart and his compass for so many years. The ranch continued to thrive under the management of Frank's descendants, and the story of how Frank and Sarah met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It became a story about fate and courage, about choosing love even when it seemed impractical or impossible, about building a life together brick by brick and day by day, until you looked around one day and realized you had created something beautiful and lasting. Years later, one of Frank and Sarah's great-great-granddaughters stood at the old fence line where they had first met, preparing to tell her own children the story of their ancestors. She looked around at the land that had been in their family for generations, at the hills and the sky and the winding road that led to the ranch, and she felt connected to the past in a profound way. "Your great-great-great-grandfather was a lonely rancher," she began, watching her children's faces light up with interest. "And one day, a traveler came to his gate, lost and looking for directions home. He tried to help her, but in the end, she told him something that changed both their lives forever. She told him he already was her home." The children asked questions, wanting to know more details, wanting to understand how two people who had just met could know they were meant for each other. And their mother did her best to explain, though she knew that some things could not really be explained, only felt. "Sometimes," she said, "we go looking for something without really knowing what we are searching for." Your great-great-great-grandmother thought she was looking for a place, for a physical home where she could start over. But what she found was something much more important. She found a person who made her feel safe and loved and understood. She found her true home, not in a place but in another person's heart. "And they lived happily ever after?" one of the children asked. The woman smiled. "They lived happily ever after, yes, but not in the way stories usually mean. They worked hard. They faced challenges. They grew old together and eventually died, as all people do. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything else bearable. They built this ranch, this legacy, this family that you are all a part of, and they did it together with love as their foundation." As the sun set over the Idaho hills, painting the sky in the same shades of gold and crimson that had colored it on the day Frank and Sarah met, the woman gathered her children and headed back to the ranch house, where several generations of Lawsons now lived and worked together. The land had been their inheritance, but the real gift Frank and Sarah had left them was something far more valuable. The knowledge that love, real love, was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any leap of faith. And somewhere, in whatever place waited beyond this life, Frank and Sarah Lawson were together again, their hands joined as they had been for so many years, watching over the family and the land they had loved so well, and knowing that their story, their love, would continue to inspire long after they were gone. They had found each other against all odds, had built a life together on hard work and dedication, and had proven that sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a single act of kindness on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere. Home, they had learned, was not about geography or buildings or any physical place. Home was about finding the person who made you want to be better, who stood beside you through storms and sunshine, who knew your worst flaws and loved you anyway. Home was about partnership and patience and choosing each other every single day. Home was about building something together that would outlast you both. Frank had given Sarah directions that long-ago day, trying to help her find her uncle's ranch. But in the end, the directions did not matter because Sarah had already found what she was truly seeking. She had found her home in Frank, and he had found his in her. And together, they had created a legacy of love that would echo through generations. A testament to the power of two people who had the courage to choose each other when the world said they barely knew each other at all. Their love story became more than just family legend. It became a beacon for others who were lost or lonely, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them. That home is not always where we think it is, and that love, real and true and lasting, is always worth the risk of opening your heart to another person. The lonely rancher and the lost traveler had found each other, had saved each other, and had built something beautiful together, and their story would live on as long as there were Lawsons on the land they had loved so well.